Hey guys, it's Greg Alexander again with Alexander the Greg Fishing. And as I promised you, I'm bringing the next video in line for seasonal patterns. I'm going to do a combo tidal water or river pre-spawn and also include a generalization about how lakes operate or reservoirs operate in the pre-spawn. So let's define the pre-spawn. The pre-spawn is a period of time right after, varies, but right after winter fishing. It's a time between winter and when the fish actually go on the beds. This period of time can be, a couple, 3 weeks, depending on how the weather changes, or it can be 3 months even in some cases. So in general, the pre-spawn would start when the water temperature is steady rising at about 52 degrees on up. That seems to get the fish motivated to get out of their winter pattern and start to feed. And the pre-spawn will generally end when they go on the beds at the mid 60s to the low 70s in water temperature. Now, in a river, fish generally spawn later or in a warmer water temperature than they do in lakes and reservoirs, in my experience. In the lakes, it seems to start as early as like 58 degrees. People will start seeing fish on beds if they have the right type of place that they can get protected, sunny, and the weather stable. In rivers, I rarely see them spawn until it's really approaching 70-degree water temperature. So it's a big difference there. So if you're a lake fisherman, you come to a river and it's 60 degrees and you think the fish are going to be on the beds, you're probably going to be disappointed. So the first thing to understand about pre-spawn and catching them is, where were the fish in wintertime? Okay. Because, it's not beam me up, Scotty, they're here and then they're here. They make a transition. Some of them make a short transition, some of them make a long transition, depending on where their wintering areas were and where they need to be to feed. Because remember, in the fall, they're feeding. So they're looking for high feeding opportunities. And in the winter, they're looking for high comfort areas. And they're going to sit back on what they've gorged all fall because they don't digest their food very well. And they don't need to be in the high feeding areas. They need to be in high comfort. So now they're going to move back to high feeding areas pre-spawn because they're getting geared up for a long strenuous spawn. So in some cases, the fish that in a river spent all river in a river eddy that was protected from the current in both directions. If you go back and watch my video on winter tidal patterns, it'll help you understand a little bit better where they were. And I'm not going to get into too much of that today. But they'll move from those main eddy areas. They won't move. They'll just move from being as deep as they could get in those eddy areas to shallow and active. Deep inactive, shallow and active in the same areas. Now, a lot of fish, they wintered in areas that aren't primed for feeding, so they'll move in a river back to the prime feeding areas, hard cover current areas. I'll talk about grass lakes and grass rivers at the end, but right now we're just talking about rivers that don't have, grass isn't their major cover. So they stay grouped up. In the early pre-spawn, they still stay grouped up. You're going to catch, if you catch one, you're probably going to catch several. They get on the big, obvious places. Thing you look driving down the river, you see a big piece of structure or a bulkhead or a big tree, or, they get on this big, obvious cover. Now in lakes, in the pre-spawn, it's all about transition banks. Okay. If you're in a steeper lake, you know, they get on bluff ends where the bluff is vertical and then it starts to lay out the flat. That's where they'll get. They'll get on rock to sand transition. You rock changes to sand. They'll be right somewhere in that area. They'll be on big rock to little rock transitions. They'll be on, if you have submerged timber in your lake, they'll be on the ends where the submerged timber ends and goes to no submerged timber. It's like an underwater point almost. And then other than transition spots, they'll start to become active on main lake points. Okay, so as the pre-spawn progresses and the water temperature rises and the fish start to get a little frisky, see, they'll start to move closer and closer to their spawning area. So they'll go from, in a lake, they'll go from a main lake point to into the creeks onto the what we call secondary points, or these little side points, rock slides, any old thing. If there's one dock over here on this side, they'll get on that. You know, they'll get on the pretty obvious stuff because they're moving shallow. So, you know, you're not going to have to search for them offshore in the pre-spawn generally, you know, all the way through the spawn and the early post-spawn. They're not going to be, most of the fish are not going to be deep. They're going to be shallow, even in lakes. So, in the very end of the spawn in a lake, for example, these fish are going to be as far back as they can be in the spawning coves in the last deep water that has some type of thing for them to hold on to. You know, lake 1, 2, 3 for the transition is main lake, mid creek, back of creek. Now, a river, tidal river, or just a regular flowing river, that's a little bit different, because most of the fish don't winter in the main river. They'll be off of the main river somewhere, or in headwaters where there's not a lot of flow. So those fish will go from their comfort zone where they comforted themselves all winter long, and they'll get back to this main flow type of thing in the river. Why? Because that's bringing the food. That's bringing the food. So sometimes they'll swim quite a bit of distance from winter to pre-spawn to start feeding. And then their next move will be main lake flow, main river flow, or main creek flow areas to almost overnight in a river. They tend to end up in the spawning areas. They don't tend to like show up on the outside corner of a marina that you're going to be catching them in spawning. It's like they go from main flow right to it. So they don't transition kind of the same way that they do in a lake. So they will, I mean, they'll get into areas if they can. If there's pre-spawn areas, you know, close to where they're going to spawn, they'll use those areas for sure. But they'll be 5 miles away, I believe, sometimes eating, and then swim 5 miles to spawn in like one day. It seems like how that works sometimes. They just kind of show up. Now, understanding that with a river, understanding that with a lake, the baits that you need to be throwing in the pre-spawn, especially the early pre-spawn, are active baits, because these fish are actively feeding. So you want to start with chatterbaits, square bills, rattle traps, spinner baits, swim baits, swim jigs, all this type of stuff that fish are going to be actively feeding. There's no need to fish real slow, because you'll catch more fish if you fish fast with power baits at this period of time. And if you fish through an area and you catch 4, 5, 6 fish, and then you don't get bit for a while, and you've changed up moving baits to try different moving baits, and you maybe catch another one, and then it seems like they quit, that's when you pick up your jig, your creature bait, your shaky head, your speed worm, your whatever, you know, whatever you're throwing that you're dragging around, your Carolina rig even, and then you mop up the fish who wouldn't respond to the fast moving bait for whatever reason. So early pre-spawn is hammer sack time. The fish are hungry, they're actively feeding. Another good thing, if you're in early pre-spawn, you ain't many people on the water fishing. It's still cool. It's not the most comfortable days a lot of times. There's no pleasure boaters running around. You can absolutely hammer them in early pre-spawn. Now, as the pre-spawn progresses and the weather gets nicer, of course, that's going to bring out the boaters, that's going to bring out the fishermen, and the fish are going to get more and more pressured. So at that point in time, when you've been fishing, you know, the last couple, 3 weeks and hammering them on chatterbaits, and then you go back and, man, they won't bite it. And you look around and there's 5 or 6 boats around, or people fishing through the same areas and whatnot. That's the time that you have to say, okay, now it's time. I got to like maybe slow down a little bit, use a few more finesse tactics, but do not be deceived. In the pre-spawn, finesse tactics catch giant fish in giant bags in the pre-spawn, okay? But there's no need to do that if you can catch them on power baits. So, and then in the late pre-spawn, right before they go on the beds, the fish are really shallow. They're roaming around. They're not quite set up making beds yet. That's when you can start to catch them good on topwater lures. You know, frogs, poppers, walking baits, things like that. Choppos, you know, that sort of thing. They're up there and they're still feeding, but they're looking, but they're shallow. So you're putting that bait right over their head, and they'll start eating topwater bait really good. So let's quickly just go over grass rivers and grass lakes. Well, grass completely changes the makeup of a river or a lake, where in non-grass rivers and lakes, everything is hard cover, lily pads maybe in some cases. Fish tend to use big main structure, you know, in lakes and rivers. Well, in a grass lake, the grass becomes the main structure. So in a river or a lake, grass is the point, the mid creek and the back creek. Fish start to use the outside edge of a grass line, or an underwater outside grass point, or some depression in the outside edge of the grass that has a log laying in it, or a shell bed, or a pile of rocks, or that type of stuff, but it's on the deeper side of the grass. Now, in a river, they'll do the same thing, except the grass that they'll use will be the grass that's, you know, in these big spawning bays or spawning coves, but they'll stay on the outside first. And then as it progresses, they'll move up until when the spawn finally comes, they're on the inside of the grass or in the middle of the grass in an opening somewhere. So that's how it works with the grass lakes. Understand, the best fishing of the year is coming up here real soon, if you don't mind some weather, because you'll get some weather. And other things that's going to mess up the pre-spawn are major cold fronts. We tend to back the fish off and make them kind of take a break for a little bit of time, or even in lakes, but especially in rivers, a bunch of rain muddies it up. But what I have found in these rivers, in the spring especially, if the lake gets or the river gets all muddied up, you probably won't do very well for about the first 2, maybe 3 days after it gets muddied up. But after about 3 days of it being muddied up, it's like the fish don't have any idea that it's muddy. And then you just have to adjust your presentation to something that they can locate in the mud, you know, spinner baits and chatterbaits and chartreuse, square bills and things like that. And they'll just keep right on eating them. I mean, I've caught them in chocolate milk after the chocolate milk had been there for 3 days or so. So these are some tips that you guys can use to help you understand the pre-spawn in rivers and lakes. Pretty simplified version of it all. Probably going to take a break from the seasonal patterns for spawn would be next. And in between now and when I do a presentation on the spawn in rivers and lakes, I'm going to come with some more bait presentations and things like that that will help you guys catch more fish. So if you like my content, please hit the like button. If it's something you want to follow on a regular basis and you think you can learn something from it, then please hit the subscribe button. It'll help you. It'll help me. I'll see you on the water, and have a blessed day.